probably a better than good chance that you've heard the expression at least once. Don't ask God for patience, because he'll give you situations that call for it. While I don't disagree at all with the sentiment of that particular statement, I would like to propose maybe an alternative of don't ask God for patience because he'll give you twin daughters. Don't misunderstand me. I love my daughters with all of my heart. I think they're the greatest things in the world. But there are times that they test mine and their mother's patience to the breaking point, and usually before they've had their Fruit Loops. It's amazing to me just how frequently these two are able to test my patience on a consistent basis. I considered myself a relatively patient man until I had kids, for the most part. But there are a few things that really seem to cause my lack of patience to hit the breaking point, and probably the easiest and quickest and most commonly used way is making me confront my biggest pet peeve in the entire world, forcing me to repeat myself. I think most of us in here, we probably don't like that particular thing, right? We don't like repeating ourselves when we've said something. It makes us feel like the person that we've been talking to wasn't listening, or that we haven't been heard in any way, shape, or form. But my girls are 9. And 9-year-olds need to be told something 3,487,216 times before it starts to sink in a little bit. And I don't like repeating myself, so it creates kind of an unusual mess all times. I find myself repeating things so many different times that I have genuinely considered purchasing a tape recorder and just recording myself saying the top 20 things that I repeat myself every single day on, and playing it in their room while they sleep at night in the hopes that maybe through osmosis it might start to sink in. There are just so many different things that I have to repeat to them all the different times. And it's almost like the plot of Groundhog Day. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, except the calendar and the day changes, just the things that I say throughout the day stay the same every day. Anyway, eventually, on occasion, I decide I am not going to repeat myself. Most of the things I end up repeating are the rules that we have in place for our children, and those rules are almost always there for their protection, right? To prevent them from doing something that might cause them pain, right? Like any good parent, that's what we want, is that we want our children to avoid pain in their lives. But eventually I reach the point where I'm just done saying these things, and I'm going to let you face the consequences, because sometimes the best way to learn a lesson is to face the pain of consequences, is it not? So take, for instance, one particular rule that we have in our house. We have wood floors in our house. And while beautiful, wood floors can be particularly slick if you are doing something foolish like, say, I don't know, running in the house while wearing socks. I have told my daughters 1,000,000 times, exactly, because I counted, not to run in the house with socks on their feet in the hopes that they wouldn't trip and fall. But after I reached 1,000,000 times telling them not to run in the house with socks on their floor, I used an app to count it. It was fantastic. I decided I'd said it enough, and that I was going to let them face the consequences of running in the house with socks on their feet on wood floors. Didn't take long. About 2 days after I'd made the decision to stop saying this particular rule, because I was tired of saying it, and to be honest with you, sometimes I like a little chaos, Robin decided that she was in a particular hurry one night before bed. And so she decided to run from our kitchen to their bedroom, which has wood floors throughout. And as Robin was making her way there, our giant doofus of a dog, Rudy, made an appearance in the hallway. And Robin tried her best to stop, but her feet kept going and actually slid out from underneath her, and she hit the floor. Now, wood floors are beautiful, but they're also very hard. And Robin learned that particular lesson the hard way. She did her best to try to play it off like it was no big deal, but it wasn't too long before tears started streaming down her face as she began to cry in pain. She had realized the consequences of her actions in a very difficult and painful way. Now understand, Robin made this decision. She made the choice knowing that it was not a good idea for her to run in the house on the wood floors with socks on her feet. She had been told that a million times. It's a really great app. See me afterwards. I'll be happy to give it to you. But she made the choice knowing that it violated the rule of our household. I made that rule. And there had been times in her existence where she had violated one of the rules that Daddy had made, and Daddy decided to add on to the consequences of her actions. And so I think because of that, Robin decided that while she was in pain and dealing with the consequences of this particular action of her life, that she decided to try and hide herself from me. She ran to the couch and threw a blanket over top of herself and cried. Again, I had made the rule. I wasn't happy about all the times that she and her sister had broken that particular rule. They'd been told a million times. But my daughter was crying and in pain. And while I may have been upset in that moment that she broke the rule, and there was a part of me that wanted her to just simply sit there and suffer the consequences of her actions, I love my daughter. And so I went over and I took the blanket off of her. I scooped her up in my arms, and I held her. I let her finish crying, and when she had finished crying, I wiped away the tears from her eyes. I gently reminded her it's not a good idea to run in the house on the wood floors with socks on your feet because this is what will happen. I reminded her that that rule is not there in place because Daddy's trying to ruin her and her sister's good time, but rather because I want to protect them, and I want them to be able to avoid things like this happening. And then I kissed her. I told her I loved her. She told me she was sorry, and I told her she was forgiven. I would love to tell you that this put an end, a definitive end, to my daughters running in the house on the wood floors with socks on their feet. But it didn't. They still do it. And one day, this is going to happen again. And they're going to suffer the consequences of their choice to break the rule of the house. And I'm going to hold them. And I'm going to tell them I love them. And I'm going to tell them they're forgiven anyway. Because that's what a loving father does. In the beginning, God created everything. You name it, God made it. He chose to speak things into existence. There was nothing, God spoke something. And something was brought forth. It's a beautiful picture of the amazing power of God. And after God had finished creating everything that there was, he decided to create the most personal and most important creation to him, and therefore the creation he loved most of all, man and woman. Adam and Eve had the entire world completely untainted and undisturbed as their playground. If you think you've seen some beautiful landscapes, they saw it before anybody else, and they saw it in perfection. And they could do whatever they wanted to. They could go wherever they wanted to. The entire world is literally their playground. There's no pain, there's no death, there's no consequences, there's no clothes, there's no restrictions, except for one. One single solitary rule that God had in place for all of creation, and that rule was simply don't eat the fruit of this one particular tree. You can eat anything else. The world is your smorgasbord. Just don't eat the fruit of that tree. Everything in creation was perfect. The relationship between God and man was perfect in its level of intimacy and its level of knowledge of one another. Adam and Eve experienced a closeness with God that we can only dream of this side of eternity. There's just one rule. Then one day a serpent comes. And the serpent has a simple question that we talked about last week, a question that plays off of what had to be the natural curiosity of Adam and Eve. Did God really say that? But more so than that, the serpent decided to question not just the rule itself, but the purpose behind that rule. Why would a loving God give you any restrictions? Why would a loving God make one rule there for you? Surely he has an ulterior motive. The serpent was cunning, was convincing. And before long, Eve, who already probably had a natural disposition to curiosity about this particular tree, suddenly shifted her mindset from curiosity to desire. The fruit of this tree appeared pleasant to her. And at the end of Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, we read, "So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it." Understand, Eve knew this was wrong. She knew the one rule that God had in store for her and Adam. She understood it. Adam understood the rule. He knew it. He was there. He could have stopped this. He could have said something. Yet both of them made a decision. They made a choice. Our natural inclination is to blame the serpent, is it not? But the serpent didn't hold their mouths open and force feed them the fruit. They made a choice. And all it took was one bite, and everything was changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. See, the fruit didn't exactly cause the reaction that they were hoping for. If you recall from last week, the serpent told them that if they ate the fruit, then they would become like God. I don't know about you, but in the entirety of everything the serpent had to say to them, that was probably the one argument that would have been enough for me. Because if we think about what it means to be like God, to hold that power, to hold that authority, to hold that understanding of everything, that's tempting. Yet when Adam and Eve bit into the fruit, things didn't exactly go the way that they had thought they were. The blessing was not as much of a blessing as they thought it would be. In verse 7, it tells us, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." Instead of the fruit making them like God, the fruit revealed to both of them for the very first time that they weren't even like each other. That there was a difference between man and woman. That there was something that was separate, something that was different between the two of them. And that eating of this fruit revealed that to them. And so they ran. And they hid part of themselves from each other. Understand, we have a tendency to look at this particular text, and we kind of get focused on the idea that they were naked, because there's always that little junior higher in us that goes, they were naked. But we're not just talking about a physical nakedness with each other. Adam and Eve, up to this point, had no reason to hide anything from each other. They experienced a level of intimacy with one another. They knew each other inside and out, both the exterior and the interior. And yet, once they do the very first thing that they know they're not supposed to do, the guilt of that situation causes them to cover, not just from God, but from each other. The guilt that they felt in that situation led them both to, for the first time ever, feel the need to hide something from one another. The relationship between man and woman was also changed. This didn't just affect the relationship between God and humanity, it affected the relationship between each other. It wasn't just a loss of innocence, it was a loss of intimacy. But it did, in fact, affect the relationship with God. It was forever changed, so much so that when Adam and Eve heard the sound of God approaching them in the garden, which again, think about how amazing that would be to be so familiar with God that you recognize the sound of him approaching you. Oh, I wish. when they heard that sound, after making that choice, they did exactly what a child who has done something that broke the rule of their father does. They hid. Verse 8 tells us they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. They ran away from God. Up to this point, they never had a reason to do so. Their relationship with God was as tight as it could ever possibly be. And yet, after choosing to break the one rule God had in store for them, when they heard God approach, they felt the need to hide, to try to cover up, to try to get away from God. It was an effort in vain, to be sure, but still their natural inclination was to try to hide. God knows something's not right. I mean, he's God after all, right? He recognizes that a shift has happened in the dynamic of their relationship. Something is different that wasn't there before. So God calls out to the man asking where he is, which he knew. He's God. Adam tells God that he and Eve are hiding because they're naked, and they felt the need to hide from him. God asks him simply, who told you you were naked? And God points out exactly what the problem is. He said that you've eaten of the fruit that I told you don't eat. You've broken the one rule that I have. The one thing I told you not to do, you did. Adam's reaction is incredibly interesting to me. Because rather than own up and say, yeah, I did, and I'm sorry, instead Adam does something that is so typical of us. We see it in verse 12. It said, the man replied, the woman you gave to be with me, she gave me some of the fruit from the tree and I ate it. Isn't it interesting that there's only two people walking God's green earth, and both of them have done something wrong, and yet Adam is trying to blame the other? Isn't that what we do? Isn't that the way that we respond to these sorts of things? Adam says it was her fault. I didn't want to, but she gave it to me. The reality is Adam made a choice. He was right there. He could have stopped it, or at the very least, he could have stopped himself. Yet when he's confronted with his actions, he tries to pass the blame. Eve does the same thing. She does. When she's confronted by God, whenever God asks her why she ate this fruit, instead of owning up to her actions and her responsibility in this matter, instead, look what she says. She says, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. Isn't it interesting that our natural inclination, when we make poor choices for ourselves, is to always try to pass the blame? Every single one of us in here is guilty of that sort of thing. Whether we blame those immediately around us, a boss who was unclear, or a spouse who didn't explain things to us in the right manner, or just somebody else, it has to be their fault. The reason we tend to do that is because in our own minds, we are the heroes of our own story. Are we not? And so it can't be our fault when things go wrong. It has to be somebody else. It has to be anybody else. It was their fault, not mine. We are, after all, creatures of tremendous vanity. And it's interesting to note that it's been that way since the beginning. God does address the serpent, but we're going to circle back to that. But understand what's just happened. Understand the gravity of this situation and the weight of what has just taken place. For the first time, in all of human history, man has disobeyed the rule and the command of its creator. This is the first instance of rebellion of man against God. We made a choice. And because of that choice, the very first sin is committed. Innocence is lost. Intimacy, not just between each other, but intimacy between God and humanity, is lost. And there are consequences for that choice. God lays out the consequences of that fateful bite for both of them in Genesis chapter 3, verses 16 through 19. He said to the woman, "I will intensify your labor pains. You will bear children with painful effort. Your desire will be for your husband, yet he will rule over you." And he said to the man, "Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree which I commanded you, do not eat from it. The ground is cursed because of you. You'll eat from it by means of painful labor all the days of your life. It'll produce thorns and thistles for you. You'll eat the plants of the field. You will eat bread by the sweat of your brow until you return to the ground, since you were taken from it. For you are dust, and you will return to dust." The consequences of their choice would change life as they know it forever. Would change life as we know it forever. Because they decided to violate the law of God, that means that now pain has entered the equation. Hurt, suffering, death are now on the table. This was not what God had planned. But because we were allowed a choice, that meant we had to suffer consequences of that choice. Everything about God's creation was meant to be different than the way that we see it. We are still feeling the ripple effects of this one decision made by these two people to violate the law and the rule of God. It would affect not just themselves, but literally every person that has come since. This is one of the most unfortunate realizations that we tend to find out too late. Simply that our actions have consequences. The choices that you and I make, whether they be well thought out, well constructed, well researched, or a decision that we make in the moment, have a consequence that we may not see. Those consequences may be good, but there may also be some bad consequences, some painful consequences, some hurtful consequences that we must face because of our choices. And yet, inevitably, when we face the consequences of our own decision-making, and those consequences turn out to be painful and hurtful, and cause suffering in our lives, we tend to try to pass the buck. Couldn't have been my fault. They made me do it. That manager, he's just an idiot, and he made me do this sort of thing. And I knew this was going to happen. I tried to tell him not to do it, but he made me do it anyway. My spouse told me something that I didn't agree with, and yet because it was them, I felt I had to do it. The devil made me do it. Our notion of refusing to suffer the consequences and refusing to really point out the truth that we have made a poor choice, and instead trying to pass the blame onto somebody else, is the very heart of arrogance and selfishness and vanity. We make these poor choices in our lives, and we believe that we shouldn't be the ones to suffer the consequences of them. And even when we have nobody else to blame, We still feel the need that if God loves us, he would spare us from these consequences of our own choices. He would save us from this. He would make it to where we didn't have to deal with this. Like we talked about last week, we have a tendency to be angry at God when we face the consequences of our own choices. The reality is something we don't want to face in the first place. That we're the ones responsible. That it was us. We made a choice. Again, whether we thought it out or it just came to us in the heat of the moment, we made a choice. And because of that choice, there are consequences that we must face. We could sit here and try to blame somebody else, but until we're willing to acknowledge our own poor decision-making, change will not happen. Until we own up to the consequences of our own actions and we blame who's really responsible, ourselves, nothing will get better. Change will not happen in our lives. If we choose to do these sorts of things, if we choose to make, we cannot have this both ways. We cannot choose to make these poor decisions and then say we don't deserve the consequences. If you were to leave this place right now, or if you were to turn off your computer and leave right now and go outside and break the law of the land, you're going to be arrested. That's going to be the consequence of your action. If you violate the law of God, if you break the rule that God had put in place for us as a means to protect us, we cannot be upset when we face the consequences. We cannot blame him for the consequences of our own decision-making. We have got to be careful about the choices that we make. When Adam and Eve bit into the fruit, it changed the relationship between God and man forever. In fact, it created something between God and man that had never existed up to that point: separation. A holy God cannot maintain a relationship with unholy sin. And therefore, the relationship between God and man was separate. The intimacy we had with God was lost. Yet there was something that God said as he spoke to the serpent itself. Something that has stood out ever since. He said in verse 15, "I will put hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head. You will strike his heel." We know that the serpent in this particular story was, in fact, Satan himself, the great deceiver. He lied to Eve. He posed the question of, did God really say that? And then lied about the reality of the situation. He led Eve and her husband Adam away from God through his temptation. And yet here God is one of the offspring of Eve will end his reign, will defeat him ultimately. Nearly every biblical scholar agrees that this is the first time in Scripture God references his Son, who will come and end the separation between God and man by removing sin. This is just after that separation is first there. The first time that God experiences a separation between himself and humanity. And he has to make a plan to fix that. He needs to find a way to remedy that situation. This is the love of God. Understand, throughout the entire creation narrative, we have talked about the power and the authority that God has over everything. God could have, in that moment, simply spoken and wiped the slate clean. He would have wiped mankind off the map. Heck, he could have wiped the map off itself. And yet, his love for us was so deep, so powerful, that when God first experiences a separation between himself and man, he's got to put a plan into action to fix it. So that one day, as God put on flesh and became Jesus Christ, that he could come down to this earth to scoop us up in his arms, to wipe away the tears that we experience because of the pain of the consequences of our own decision making, to tell us that we are still loved, and that we are forgiven. This is God. This is his love for each and every one of us. That even though we made the choice, and even though we suffer the consequences, even though we still feel the pain, that we can still be forgiven for making the choice to rebel against him. May we never, never lose sight of how significant that really is.